All right, Ninja Nerds, in this video, we're going to talk about the various different types of anemia. So first off, like every video, what is anemia? What is meant by anemia? Anemia, by definition, is low oxygen carrying capacity. So we can also even give it another definition as though it's a low amount of red blood cells. But again, the overall concept is that anemia is low oxygen carrying capacity, whether it be due to a decreased number of red blood cells or dysfunctional red blood cells, right? All right, so, and we would see that on hematocrit. We would see a lower than normal erythrocyte layer on the hematocrit. So we'd have a low PCV or a low HCV, less than 45%. All right, so here we have a whole bunch of different types of anemias listed. We're gonna go through each one systematically, mentioning what's going on with these. All right, so let's start over here with the first one being iron deficiency anemia. So with iron deficiency anemia, what would you notice? What's the first thing that you would notice within these individuals? So in general, the symptoms of anemia are pretty much straightforward across the board. But with this type right here, you'll notice that they're probably going to develop symptoms. And again, these symptoms are going to be pretty much similar across the board. It might be a little bit different for other types of anemia. But generally, they're going to have a shortness of breath or dyspnea, right? So they'll have some shortness of breath, right? SOB. Not what you think it means. So again, SOB is shortness of breath or dyspnea. Second thing that they might have is they're also probably maybe going to have some fatigue because they're not going to have as much oxygen being delivered to their tissues, right? So they're going to have some fatigue, all right? Another thing that they might also have is whenever you have a low amount of red blood cells, it triggers a change in the volume of your heart and it increases the workload of your heart. So it can lead to increased workload on the heart. And it can lead to what's called tachycardia. And it can lead to a bunch of other things. But in general, you're going to notice this. They're going to have shortness of breath. They're going to be fatigued. They're going to have an increased workload on the heart, tachycardia. And they can even maybe have some dizziness too because of not getting enough oxygen, right? So they might even have a little bit of dizziness. Maybe even some syncope depending upon how bad the anemia is. All right, but that's in general the symptoms of it. All right, so with iron deficiency anemia, what would you see here? Well, the iron deficiency is pretty much simple. It's a deficiency in iron. But what is iron needed for? If you remember, we got iron from the GI tract. What do we need with iron? Iron is essential to be able to incorporate into hemoglobin. You know there's a pigment called protoporphyrin 9. What happens with protoporphyrin 9? It reacts with the iron through what's called a ferrochelatase, which converts the iron and the protoporphyrin into heme. And what is heme essential for? For making hemoglobin. So without the iron, can you make functional hemoglobin? No. So with low iron levels, you have low amounts of heme, and with low amounts of heme, you're going to have low amounts of hemoglobin, dysfunctional hemoglobin, right? Another thing is hemoglobin is what takes up most of the cell volume within this red blood cell. So if you're decreasing in your hemoglobin, the cell will be smaller. And we can determine that through what's called when you do a blood test, you can determine that through what's one of the red blood cell indices, which is called mean corpuscular volume. And all mean corpuscular volume is, you just take, what you do for this person right here is you'll take the hematocrit, which is about 45, right? And then you'll take that, multiply that by 10, and then divide that by the total number of red blood cells for every 1 liter, which is about 5, but it'll be a trillion. And then you multiply it by 100, and it gives you about 90 femtoliters. Well, in these individuals, they're going to have a mean corpuscular volume less than 90 femtoliters, right? So that's what you would see. And this is called whenever the MCV is actually going to be less than 90 femtoliters. Okay, so whenever the MCV is less than 90 femtoliters, we give it a term, it's called microcytic or microcytosis. What does that mean? That means that the red blood cells are really, really small. They're not having enough hemoglobin, they're not going to be able to deliver as much oxygen to the tissues, and they'll produce symptoms such as shortness of breath, fatigue, increased workload on the heart, tachycardia, dizziness, so on and so forth, right? That's the overall concept here. Now, what is the cause of iron deficiency anemia? The causes are usually pretty straightforward. Usually it's because of blood loss. Okay, causes are usually due to blood loss. Maybe you have some type of ulcer. Okay, you could be losing blood that way. A more common cause is usually with women who who actually have heavy menstruation, menorrhagia, right? So due to heavy menstruation, okay? That's another one, so heavy menstruation. And what's one more? One more could even be due to, think about it, not getting enough iron in your diet. So not enough iron in the diet. So low iron diet, which is a little bit more common with individuals who are vegetarians, right? Okay, so in summary, what would you notice with iron deficiency? Symptoms such as shortness of breath, fatigue, increased workload in the heart, tachycardia, dizziness. You would take their red blood cell indices, and it would be their mean corpuscular volume would be less than 90 femtoliters, which is called microcytosis or microcytic anemia. So they have this tiny little red blood cells. And what would be the cause of this? It could be blood loss, could be heavy menstruation, could be a low iron diet. What would you do for this person? You probably want to give them more iron. So what's the treatment? Give them more iron. You're probably not going to want to do too many transfusions, but you could do transfusions also, all right? But that's pretty much that. All right, so that settles our iron deficiency. Let's go on to the next one. Pernicious anemia, or B12, maybe even folic acid deficiencies, right? So what is B12 important for? Remember that from the erythropoiesis process, right? You take in B12 and you take in folic acid. Can come from, B12 is usually coming from more of the leafy vegetables. It can even come from certain types of meat sources. Folic acid is from the leafy vegetables and meat sources, right? So these guys are coming in here, right? So here's the B12. We're going to focus on this one first. It comes in, right, and it gets to the stomach. Now here's what's the problem. Most people think, oh, it's just a deficiency within B12, like not taking enough in. That's not really the main cause of it. The main cause that they have found is that it's an autoimmune condition. So you know that there's these cells within your stomach called the parietal cells. And your parietal cells secrete a glycoprotein. And that glycoprotein is called intrinsic factor. So here's this blue protein, and this blue protein is called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor. And what happens? B12 naturally binds to intrinsic factor. That's what B12 wants to do. It wants to bind with the intrinsic factor. Well, here's the problem. In some individuals, their immune system somehow produces antibodies that will actually bind to the intrinsic factor. So it'll produce these antibodies, and look what happens. These antibodies bind to the intrinsic factor, blocking B12 from being able to bind. And if B12 can't bind, can B12 get absorbed? No, because we need the intrinsic factor for that receptor-mediated endocytosis mechanism, right? To get the B12 into the bloodstream, where it can bind to transcobalamin 1 or 2, right? So again, we'll just draw here a green. I'm not going to list it, but you know it was transcobalamin 1 and 2. Well, what happens? If this antibody attacks the intrinsic factor and B12 can't bind, will you be able to absorb B12? No. So there'll be less B12 within the bloodstream. What was B12 very important for again? B12 was needed in order for the red blood cells' DNA to mature and condense. And if the DNA doesn't mature and condense, then what's going to happen? Your actual red blood cells are going to be huge. And they'll have, okay, so again, what will happen here with this person? They'll have a red blood cell that's going to be really, really big. Okay, well, we already talked about microcytic. What will be the problem here then? Well, if you look here, you do an MCV. And again, you already know what it is. You take their hematocrit over the total number of red blood cells, multiply it by 100, right? And normally it's 90 femtoliters. Well, this person is actually going to have large red blood cells. So their MCV will be greater than 90 femtoliters. This term is called macrocytosis or macrocytic. Okay, so macrocytosis or macrocytic. So they'll have very, very large red blood cells. And these red blood cells, would they be able to deliver as much oxygen? No, because the DNA didn't mature very well. So again, what is B12 needed for? It's needed for DNA maturation and even some synthesis and condensation of the DNA. And without that, what's going to happen? Can the red blood cells completely mature? No. Will they make enough functional hemoglobin? Not necessarily, and these are so big that they can actually get stuck inside the capillaries and they can go undergo hemolysis, and so you can actually lose red blood cells that way. Okay, so that's one thing. Folic acid, same thing, whatever. This has a different mechanism of absorption, but for whatever reason, if you're not able to get enough folic acid within the diet for whatever reason, folic acid is also needed, right? So folic acid is also needed in order for the DNA to mature, okay? So now, people with this, we already know their symptoms are pretty much going to be the same kind of concept. What would you do to treat them? Well, B12 isn't getting adequately absorbed. So we have to get into the bloodstream a different way, a different route. So what we can do is we can do intramuscular injections. So what will be the treatment of this person usually? So IM, intramuscular, injections of B12. Okay? That's probably what we're going to do most likely. Now, this can occur sometimes not just autoimmune, but in some elderly individuals as their stomach gets smaller, the intrinsic factor production decreases. Okay? So again, treatment of this would usually be intramuscular injections of B12. All right, so that pretty much gives us everything we know about B12 and folic acid. All right, next one. Hereditary spherocytosis. This is a genetic condition, okay? So it's some type of hereditary condition, as it says in the name, where there's some type of mutation, right? So remember we talked about this very briefly in the lifespan of a red blood cell. It has these, plasma membrane proteins, right? What were these proteins called again? What was this green webby protein called? This one was called spectrin. This little red protein, which is anchoring the spectrin to the actual transmembrane protein, is called ankyrin. And then these proteins can obviously, these transmembrane or blue proteins can be tons of different types. They can be band 3, protein 4.1, they could be glycophorins, there's tons of these, right? But what was the most important ones I told you before? Spectrin and ankyrin. These are the ones, if there's some type of deficiency or there's some type of mutation where these proteins aren't either produced or aren't adequately produced, then the cell membrane is not going to be as flexible and it's not going to hold it into this biconcave shape. If it can't hold into this biconcave shape, it actually takes on a spherical form. And look at this red blood cell. It's spherical. And that's why we call it spherocytosis. So this one, because of that, it throws off its actual MCV. And sometimes the MCV can fluctuate, but it's usually considered to be what's called microcytic. Usually it's microcytic, but it's hyperchromic. But the actual chromicity is not actually going to be as much in the edges now. It's going to be all over the place. So it's not going to be able to be good at delivering the oxygen effectively. And this is commonly captured and caught within those sinusoidal capillaries within your spleen or your liver or your bone marrow. So what is one of the symptoms that these people will develop? If they have this, it can actually get stuck inside the spleen. So let's say here's the spleen right here, right? And here's the actual blood vessels coming into the spleen right here. So here's the actual blood vessels coming into the spleen. If that guy right there, that red blood cell gets stuck in those sinusoidal capillaries, macrophages will actually phagocytose it that we talked about before, break it down into its components. But what's another thing? If we have enough of these guys getting stuck in there, what will be the symptoms then? You'll notice the spleen getting bigger. And what is that called? Splenomegaly. Okay, so they might have an enlarged spleen maybe, depending upon how severe this is, right? And they're not going to get enough oxygen to the tissue cells because there's going to be hemolysis. And so they'll have similar symptoms, right? And then you might even have splenomegaly. So that pretty much gives us hereditary spherocytosis. So it's deficiency or mutation with an ankyrin and spectrin, which causes the red blood cells to become spherical, right? Which then can cause them to get caught inside of capillaries and undergo hemolysis and can lead to splenomegaly. All right, let's go to my personal favorite here, G6PD-H deficiency, right? So it stands for, what does that stand for? It stands for glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase. So this right here is actually a deficiency. This anemia is a deficiency in this enzyme. Now you're probably wondering, where the heck does glucose actually have to do anything with this? Well, here's where it's very interesting. There is a specific mechanism. You know that red blood cells, they can't do aerobic cellular respiration. They can only do glycolysis. So they can only convert glucose into pyruvate, right? And they can make lactic acid, they can make 2,3-BPG, a whole bunch of other things. But another important thing is that there's other things that can happen, not just within these red blood cells, but it can happen in other cells. It's actually more common in other cells, but it can also do what's called a pentose phosphate pathway, where it goes to make what's called ribose 5-phosphate. I'm just going to put R5P. But in order for it to do that, so let's come actually down here. So let's say here's glucose, and it has to go through 3 series of steps. One is actually called 6-phosphoglucanolactone, glucanolactone, and then it actually will go from that. It'll eventually go to what's called R5P, which is ribulose or ribose 5-phosphate. So it'll actually turn into ribulose. And here's what's important. In these steps, there's a molecule called NADP positive that gets converted into what's called NADPH. And over here, there'll be NADP positive into NADPH. Why is this NADPH so important? Well, you know there's a lot of free radicals that our body produces all the time, okay? It's producing these things all the time. Remember we have the superoxide anion. You can have the hydroxide free radical. You can have the, you can even have specifically the hypochlorous acid. You can have hydrogen peroxide. And these are your free radicals, right? So these are reactive oxygen species. What is the danger of these? These can damage all kinds of different stuff within our body. Well, there's a molecule called glutathione. So I'm just going to draw a big G here, right? Big G here. It has these things called sulfhydryl groups, these little thiols, right? It's a thiol group. And what happens is, when these actual glutathiones, this is again, what is this called? It's called glutathione. So these molecules are called glutathione. These glutathiones will actually take some of these hydrogens and these electrons from these reactive oxygen species to make them less toxic, right? To be able to block their dangerous effect. So what it does is, it'll actually combine, maybe it'll donate some of these hydrogens onto this oxygen here, right? So it can actually donate some of these hydrogens onto the oxygen. It can donate some of these hydrogens onto the H2O2 and make water, right? So how will it do that? When it does that, it gets converted into what's called, so this is the reduced form of glutathione. But then it can get oxidized when it does that reaction to be able to act as an antioxidant. And then they're actually linked together. How are they linked together? They're linked together through disulfide bonds. How is that causing a problem? Well, in order for them to go back so that they can actually catch more free radicals, they depend upon NADPH. So they need NADPH for this step. NADPH drops off those hydride ions and those electrons, right, to make NADP positive. And that converts this guy back into the reduced form. And there's an enzyme that drives the step called glutathione peroxidase and reductase enzymes, right? But what's the important thing? We need him in order to get him back into the proper antioxidant form so that we can prevent these reactive oxygen species from accumulating. But what happens is we don't have this enzyme right here. This is where that enzyme works, G6PDH, glucose-6-phosphate dehydrogenase. Can you make an ADPH if you don't have him? No. If you have a deficiency or you don't have him, you don't have less NADPH. And if you have less NADPH, then what's going to happen? You're not going to be able to make as much reduced form of glutathione. Can you hold on to these reactions? Can you prevent these reactive oxygen species from accumulating? No. What will these reactive oxygen species do? They'll damage the hemoglobin. So what they'll do is, imagine here, I have a hemoglobin molecule right here. What it'll do is the reactive oxygen species will damage these guys. So it'll damage the actual hemoglobin. And the hemoglobin will start like precipitating. And when it starts precipitating, it actually goes and binds on to the actual inner cell membrane. And now look at it. It binds onto this inner cell membrane. And when it binds onto this inner cell membrane, it causes the red blood cell membrane to become less flexible, less pliable, less able to bend and squeeze through capillaries. What can that do? That can cause a hemolytic anemia where it will actually destroy these red blood cells and our red blood cell count will drop, and that causes anemia. What are these things here called? They're called Heinz bodies. So whenever you do the test, you'd actually look for this, right? So you'd be able to look for the Heinz bodies. How would you be able to detect hereditary spherocytosis? There is a test. It's called a Coombs test. Just wanted to give that to you right there. It's a Coombs test. Okay? Do a Coombs test for that. Maybe we'll talk about that in future videos. So again, that's the whole problem with this, is that you get these Heinz bodies that actually decreases the flexibility of the red blood cell membrane. It can't squeeze through the capillaries and it causes hemolysis, right? Which again, red blood cells decrease, and then what else decreases with it? Oxygen. And then you have anemia, right? Sickle cell anemia, also abbreviated HBS, right? Sickle cell hemoglobin, or because you have the sickle cell hemoglobin, right? What happens here? It's a point mutation, or specifically, there's different types of point mutations, where there's missense mutations and there's nonsense mutations. This is an example of what's called a missense mutation. So what do I mean by that? if you have a string of hemoglobin, let's say here's an amino acid, here's an amino acid, here's an amino acid, here's an amino acid, right? So this is the beads of amino acids that make up the primary structure of hemoglobin. If I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the sixth amino acid on usually the most common chain it occurs on is the beta chain. Because you know hemoglobin, you have adult hemoglobin here. It usually has 2 alpha and 2 beta. Well, on the beta chains, the sixth amino acid is normally, it's glutamic acid, or they denote it with the 3-letter abbreviation GLU, right? What happens is there's a missense mutation where GLU gets actually converted into valine. And these amino acids are different in their physical properties and in their pKa's. And, okay? So then what's going to happen then? GLU right here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, gets converted into valine. And valine is a hydrophobic amino acid. Glutamic acid is a hydrophilic or polar amino acid. So it changes the overall 3-dimensional structure. And then what happens is, imagine this being a hemoglobin molecule right here. This black blob right here. What happens is, in the normal red blood cell, the hemoglobins start polymerizing and start connecting to one another. And whenever they start connecting to one another and polymerizing, so again, what are these molecules here called? These are called hemoglobin. The hemoglobin molecules undergo a polymerization. And whenever they polymerize, they take on this weird structure. And it takes on this sickle shape. And what does that sickle shape again due to? It's due to the polymerization of the hemoglobin molecules because of the missense mutation from glutamic acid into valine. But let me even be more specific, because sickle cell anemia, it's not always sickle celled. It's not always in the sickle shape. What actually causes it to go into the sickle shape and to polymerize like that? It's whenever they're not bound to oxygen. Okay, so whenever it's in this shape is when it's not bound to oxygen. Okay, so because normally oxygen's bound here. Whenever oxygen leaves, which is the internal respiration, when oxygen leaves, it changes the overall 3-dimensional shape of the hemoglobin molecule. And that's when it takes on that sickle shape, because they start polymerizing with one another. And whenever they get the oxygen back, it actually will depolymerize and take it back on. So this is that cycle where you're going from a sickle shape to a normal red blood cell. What's that process called? It's called sickling. And this can consistently keep occurring. And what's the problem with sickling? Look at these red blood cells. They're easier to get stuck in capillaries. And if they get stuck in capillaries, they undergo hemolysis. They can occlude the blood vessel. That's one of the big things with sickle cell anemia, is that it can cause a very, very dangerous thing, which is called a vaso-occlusive crisis. So in other words, this can get stuck in different areas of the body. Very embarrassing area is, one of them is the penile arterioles. So when usually these people, it's very sad, they come to the ER and they actually have what's called priapism. And it's very sad, and it's just a very painful and prolonged erection due to the actual vessels, vessels being clogged with the sickle cells. It can get stuck in the spleen, and that can cause splenomegaly, right? So they might even have to remove the spleen, which is not good depending upon the age of the individual, because spleen is important for being able to destroy encapsulated bacteria like Streptococcus pneumonia, Neisseria meningitis, and even Haemophilus influenza, right? So this is really, really dangerous with sickle cell. They might have priapism, splenomegaly, and other things where it can get stuck, right? So again, and the reason why is because of a point mutation where glutamic acid is replaced with valine, changes the overall structure, and whenever it's not bound to oxygen, it sickles and polymerizes and makes this sickle shape. But then when it binds oxygen, it goes back into the normal structure. And this sickling can actually lead to, again, vaso-occlusive crises. Just a couple examples, priapism and splenomegaly, okay? There is a way that they try to treat this. They try to give transfusions. They try to be able to give them oxygen. Actually, that's one of the biggest treatments. You give them a lot of oxygen. So one of the biggest treatments is you give them oxygen. So that's one way that you can treat it. They also give pain relievers. So they sometimes will give them certain types of opioids, maybe, depending upon the severity of the pain. They probably give them fluids because of some of the blood loss that they might have. And another thing that they can give that they're showing it might have effect is what's called hydroxyurea. And all hydroxyurea does is it increases the amount of fetal hemoglobin. We're not going to get into that because it'll take too long, but it just makes more fetal hemoglobin, which is helpful for them getting enough oxygen to the tissues. One last cool thought, sickle cell anemia has been found with people who have it. It shows a resistance to malaria, which is good, but at the same time, it's, pick your poison, right? So sickle cell anemia, again, could have resistance to the Plasmodium falciparum, which causes the malaria, all right? That's sickle cell. Let's go on to the next one, hemorrhagic anemia. So if you look here, we got a guy, we're the ninja nerds, right? So we have a little ninja nerd star, it hit this guy and he's now bleeding, right? He's losing blood. And this is the easiest one. If you're losing blood, what's happening? You're losing red blood cells. If you're losing red blood cells, so again, what's gonna happen to this person? There's gonna be a decrease in red blood cells. And if you decrease your red blood cells, what do? You decrease the oxygen carrying capacity, right? And if you decrease oxygen carrying capacity, what do you have? You have a form of anemia, but this is hemorrhagic anemia, right? Another thing that can happen, sometimes people who have what's called the Helicobacter pylori, or maybe they've been taking NSAIDs for a very, very severe long amount of time, they can develop peptic ulcers, right? And these peptic ulcers can actually eventually perforate and cause bleeding, and they're losing blood. And if they lose that blood, again, what do? They lose red blood cells, they lose oxygen, and it can just keep going on and on and on. It could be gunshot wounds, stab wounds, aortic aneurysms. So if there's an aneurysm of the aorta or an aneurysm within the cerebral vessels, you're losing blood, you're losing oxygen, and again, it can cause anemia. So this is a pretty easy one. It's just due to blood loss, all right? And again, for this one, you're obviously gonna have to give them more, maybe depending upon the severity, you might have to give them more red blood cells, you might have to give them fluid, you might have to even go in and surgically fix whatever the vessel is that's, if it's severely damaged, okay? All right, aplastic anemia. Aplastic anemia is actually kind of a misnomer. And the reason why is, I'll explain it here in a second, is it's not just red blood cells that are actually being affected with this. It's usually also platelets and white blood cells. So it's actually a misnomer to call it anemia. All right, but anyway, if you remember from the leukopoiesis and the erythropoiesis videos, we have that hemocytoblast, right? So I'm just gonna put hemocytoblast that gets converted into a myeloid stem cell, and it gets converted into a lymphoid stem cell, right? What can happen is sometimes people, for 65% of aplastic anemia is idiopathic. In other words, it can be caused by drugs like chloramphenicol, could be caused by benzenes, could be caused by streptomycin. A lot of different drugs are actually the most common cause of aplastic anemias, but it could be due to viruses like the cytomegalovirus virus, Epstein-Barr virus, could be due to radiation. So many causes. There is another one called Fanconi syndrome, but we're not going to talk about that. Just know it's usually some type of destruction of the bone marrow. And usually where it's affecting it is right here. Look, what can myeloid stem cells go and form again? They can form the 3 different types of lineages, right? They can form red blood cells, they can form white blood cells, and they can form platelets. And usually what happens is this step right here is affected. You're usually destroying the myeloid stem cells. And if you're destroying the myeloid stem cells, you're not just destroying the red blood cell production, white blood cell production, but also the platelet production. So what does that mean then? That means that these people will have low red blood cells. They'll have low white blood cells, and they'll have low platelets. Now, we know low red blood cells is anemia, low white blood cells is leukopenia, and low platelets is thrombocytopenia. But all together, it's actually called Pancytopenia. So that's one thing that you want to know about aplastic anemias. It's not just usually red blood cells are affected, but it's also white blood cells and platelets that are affected. And that's called pancytopenia. Now, aplastic anemia, we already said a couple things of what it could be due to. Obviously, for these people, depending upon the severity, you might have to do a bone marrow transplant. You might have to be able to constantly undergo certain types of transfusions. Depending upon the severity, obviously, with the destruction of the bone marrow, sometimes there's not much you can do besides maybe just trying to treat the symptoms. And again, if there's a possibility, maybe a bone marrow transplant. All right, so that's pretty much aplastic anemia, all right, in a nutshell. So again, what would you notice about these people? They would have, again, pancytopenia as one of the clinical signs here. And again, some of their symptoms are going to be pretty much the same, right, because they're not going to have as much red blood cells. But what else would they have besides that? They would also have, if you're losing white blood cells, what would happen then? You might have an increased incidence of infections because your white blood cells are lower, right? So that could be one clinical sign. And if you're losing platelets, what would that cause? You would actually not be able to clot as much. And if you don't clot as much, what would these people have when they have thrombocytopenia? I'm not sure how you say it's called, petechiae or petechiae, whatever, but it's basically small bruises. You would have these little bruises that are kind of widespread. Okay, so they can actually produce what's called increased bruising or bleeding. Okay, so that's one thing. And again, bone marrow transplant is probably the best option for these individuals, but probably being able to treat them with antibiotics and giving them platelet transfusions and red blood cell transfusions, that's going to be very important for these individuals too, okay? Last one here, thalassemia. Thalassemia is more common within the Mediterranean ancestry. So it's more common within the Mediterraneans, okay? Mediterraneans ancestry. Okay, so this is more common within the Mediterranean ancestry. And what it is it's actually a genetic condition. And genetic meaning that, remember hemoglobin. One more time here, we had the hemoglobin A1, right? And that's made up of 2 alpha and 2 beta. What's the problem with these individuals? There's 2 types of thalassemia. There's alpha thalassemia, and then there's beta thalassemia. Now, by telling you that, I basically kind of gave you what's happening with these individuals. It's usually whenever they're having a faulty or missing globin chain. If they're missing an alpha, so let's say that this person is missing an alpha, so they have only an alpha plus 2 beta. What would this person have? If they only have 1 alpha and 2 beta, this would be what's called alpha thalassemia. And what if this person has 2 alpha, but maybe they lose 1 beta? So if they lose a beta, then what's this one going to be? This is going to be beta thalassemia. Okay, and again with these individuals, because it's a genetic mutation, what they actually are trying to do, one more thing actually before I mention that. Because you're missing hemoglobin, what happens to the cell volume? It would drop, right? So again, what would they have? Their mean corpuscular volume, would it be less than or greater than 90 femtoliters? Because they're getting smaller, it'd be less than. So they would have a mean corpuscular volume that would be less than 90 femtoliters. So what is that called? It's called microcytic anemia, right? So this is another type of microcytic anemia. The other one that we mentioned was iron deficiency, but thalassemia is also another type of a microcytic anemia because the mean corpuscular volume is less than 90 femtoliters. With these individuals, again, they have, because of their condition, usually the best way to treat this is you're constantly giving them perfusion. So they're constantly getting, not perfusions, transfusions. They're getting transfusions. They may be even taking iron supplements. They might be getting oxygen. But hopefully, if Lord willing for them, if they can get what's called a bone stem cell transplant, that would be ideal because then it would help them to be able to make more functional hemoglobin. Okay, so again, with these individuals, it would be desirable for them to get a bone stem cell transplant, but if not, then they're going to be consistently getting transfusions. And again, it's just trying to manage the symptoms of these individuals. Okay? All right, so in a nutshell, we've basically described all the different types of anemias. Okay, so again, what were those anemias? One more time. And just in a general look, iron deficiency anemia was one, all right, which is a microcytic anemia. B12 and folic acid deficiency, which is a macrocytic anemia. Hereditary spherocytosis, which is usually some type of genetic mutation where they're not making the specific types of red blood cell membrane proteins. And this is a hemolytic anemia. G6-PDH deficiency, where they're actually, again, a mutated form or deficiency of this enzyme that's needed for antioxidant help, because if not, reactive oxygen species accumulate and cause damage in Heinz bodies and hemolytic anemia. Sickle cell, which is again a genetic condition, which there is actually a point mutation or a missense mutation, where it changes the actual overall shape of the red blood cell into a sickle shape and can lead to vaso-occlusive crises, right? Hemorrhagic anemia, just due to some type of blood loss, whether it be acute or chronic, all right? Usually it's a little bit more acute, but it can be chronic. and aplastic anemia, which is usually a misnomer because it really should be called aplastic pancytopenia, where there's some type of bone marrow damage to the myeloid stem cell, which is not only decreasing red blood cells, but also platelets and white blood cells, which can lead to anemia, infections, increased incidence of infections, and bruising and bleeding, right? And again, best way to treat these people is maybe a bone marrow transplant, but if not, you're just gonna give them transfusions, all right? And then the last one is thalassemia, which is more common within the Mediterranean ancestry, and it's a genetic condition in which they produce a faulty globin chain. If they're missing an alpha, it's an alpha thalassemia. If they're missing a beta globin, then it's a beta thalassemia. And again, with these individuals, the mean corpuscular volume is low, so they have a microcytic anemia, all right? And the best way to treat these people is constant transfusions, but if possible, you could possibly do a bone stem cell transplant. And one last thing that before I mention anything is, again, usually one thing with the sickle cell anemia and hereditary spherocytosis is sometimes, depending upon the severity of it, if it's very, very consistent and chronic blocking and vaso-occlusive crises, you might have to do a splenectomy. By removing the spleen, it is a danger because, again, depending upon the age of the individual or just in general, they won't have the ability to fight off specific types of encapsulated bacteria such as Streptococcus pneumonia, again, Neisseria meningitis, and also Haemophilus influenza, right? So there is a danger of that. Again, in this video, we covered all the anemias. I hope you guys made sense. See you, Ninja Nerds.